one?
It's all you.
Okay. All right. With regard to the value of faith, I don't plan on defending a strong position that any religious person's faith is objectively valuable or virtuous or good. I just want to defend the possibility that someone somewhere is, and all I really have to do that is to take as a default position the possibility that there is a God, that as an abstract possibility, and that deity, whatever we mean by that, has revealed its existence and began some sort of relationship with somebody, and that it was reasonable for that person to accept what that deity revealed. If those are possibilities that are on the table, then it cannot be ruled out that some people somewhere have a virtuous religious faith. Virtuous in the sense that there is some virtue in trusting someone for whom trust is due.
Okay. That's an interesting approach. Not quite what I was expecting, but interesting nonetheless. I would point out, however, that even if such a person did exist, we have no way of determining that they ever existed, and unfortunately, faith is of no value in determining whether or not they actually had such a, shall we say, virtuous experience, a virtuous belief, virtuous trust in the experience they claim to have experienced. Because the problem is, faith doesn't tell you anything. It can't tell you that you're wrong. It can only tell you to keep believing that you're right, even in the absence of evidence or in contradiction to the evidence. So I don't believe that even if someone had a genuine experience and there genuinely was a God that reached down and touched somebody in some significant way, that they would be able to say that they actually had such an experience using faith. Faith would not be of any utility to them.
Well, that's a strongly stated position, but I'm not sure how that can be. I'm not sure how that can be defended, because if that did happen, the person to whom it happened would know it.
Well, no, they would believe it, but faith can't tell them that they're actually correct. See, here's an example. People who are watching this can't see this, but I'm holding up a box. Do you see my box?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Faith cannot tell you the contents of this box. If I
Right.
tell you what's in the box, you can either believe me or you can not believe me,
Right.
or you can actively disbelieve me. Now, if I
Yeah.
tell you there's a quarter in here, it's reasonably believable. We've known each other for a while. You'd probably just accept that on some tentative trust, faith, if you
Yes, I
will,
would.
based on the experience that you've had, knowing that I am a generally honest person. If, on the other hand, I tell you that the Hope Diamond is in here, you'd probably want to see it. And if I tell
Yeah.
you that somebody's skull is in here, or some alien egg is in here,
Right.
there comes a point where you would be almost insane to not actively disbelieve.
Sure.
But faith will never tell you whether the contents of that box are as I have said they are.
Faith comes in after that. Faith is continuing to believe someone for whom trust is due. That's how I'm defining it. That's what makes it virtuous insofar as it is. And if it isn't, it's because the person doesn't due the trust. Sometimes there's different degrees of due here. Obviously, people can have deeper relationships. So, clearly, there's a certain point, obviously, where no matter how much trust is due, if someone's saying something really preposterous, one is going to want a little bit more than just their word. And that's not unreasonable.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I would say that when it comes to the notion that the uber galactic super deity that created everything in the universe chose one special person out of the hundreds of millions of people who lived in the ancient world, I'd say that would be very considerable and require rather more than any amount of faith or trust. especially retroactively from our perspective looking
Sure,
back.
if there was nothing between now and then, just that person's claim.
Well, I mean, obviously, lots of time and events have transpired between that point and this, but the event itself is so far removed into the mists of time that we lack any reasonable means to appraise that outside of the context of the statement. Faith would not be a good reason for us to believe that, say, Paul, that his experience was anything more than a epileptic fit, which today, the story that he first told, it sounds a lot like an epileptic fit. In ancient times, people believed that epilepsy was the consequence of God's communications. Hippocrates actually had to write against that kind of belief and say that it was just an ordinary disease. Paul wouldn't have known better and would have believed that his experience was genuine. He would not have been a liar in that. He just didn't know any better. But here today, 2,000 years after the fact, I look at his story and say, yeah, the guy had a fit. He had a seizure and had a hallucination.
Okay. I'm going to, rather than take the hard position of proving that what Paul's experience was supernatural and not an epileptic fit, I'm going to not, and also not ignoring your example, I'm going to address it by showing that it's possible and then moreover reasonable for me to think that there was more to it than that, by pointing out that from Paul's testimony, when he had this experience, it was like a download, and he found out things that he had no earthly way of knowing. And then when he had contact with the disciples, the original apostles, the ones that Jesus Christ selected, and they compared notes, he said, they added nothing to me. And then we have documents later, from later in the tradition, and there's no internecine war between the Jerusalem apostles and Peter, who goes to Rome, and Paul's group.
I beg to differ. I mean, in Galatians, Paul goes so far as to wish his opponents would castrate themselves. Paul doesn't seem to think, as I recall, very highly of the other disciples.
Well, you're mistaken about that. Because he doesn't say they're wrong. He says they added nothing to me. And Peter says Paul's stuff is hard to understand. But that's the way it is with all Scripture.
I mean, James and Paul read like a back and forth argument between the two over the means of salvation. Paul really seems to have taken his experience to have been superior to the experiences of others.
There is no real conflict. This would be a good thing to do as its own separate debate.
Yeah, it would. But going back to where we were,
conflict between James and Paul.
in terms of the question of whether or not faith would apply here, in Paul's terms, it probably would have. But that's all Paul had. Now we have other options that weren't really known to him. Alternative explanations for events. And faith is not going to get us to whether or not these events took place as described. I mean, there's nowhere in the historical methods of evaluation that says, okay, now apply faith, because faith doesn't tell you anything.
Paul clearly would not agree that all he had to go on was faith, because he had that experience that you're calling epilepsy, and that I think is more. So he, from his perspective, had a direct revelation.
Yes, or so he believed. But again, how would faith tell you if something is actually a direct revelation or a hallucination? See, now if I were given a direct revelation, I'm a rational, pragmatic, empirical skeptic. So I would seek falsification. For example, if I thought a deity was speaking to me right now, I would ask for specific knowledge that I wouldn't have access to, but could otherwise confirm, so that I would know that some form of knowledge was coming from outside of myself. I might not know immediately that, okay, this is definitely a deity. For all I know, it could be an alien. But at least I would know
But
I
it wouldn't
wasn't
be
completely crazy.
hallucination. Hallucinations can't give you novel information. It's actually
Exactly.
objectively true.
Yeah.
And as I pointed out, from the record, it indicates that may have happened. There's nothing that doesn't indicate that happened, where someone has to just make that up that it could have. The record says it did. You can dispute the record, you can doubt it, but the record says that it did happen exactly that way.
Well, but the thing is, Paul, who knew who Christians were, he knew what they believed. I mean, he didn't come out of nowhere. It's not like he was from China and had never heard of them before. It's not like he was in China and got a revelation in Beijing and walked all the way to the Near East.
True, but the apostles were privy to things that no one else knew about. And that's what they couldn't add to him because he already knew it.
Yeah, but it was all, we don't really know what exactly was what was known to him through this that wasn't already known to him prior to this point. I mean, the guy lived in the area, he knew who Christians were, he knew them well enough to hunt them down, he obviously knew something of their theology, and the theology was rather novel at the time, it was still in its infancy. There wasn't, plainly put, since the Gospels themselves hadn't been written, and there were no other, or very few writings at the time, it's unlikely that there was much that was unknown to him.
Oh, there could have been plenty. I mean,
there could have been, but these are things that are now probably lost to us. So we don't have any notes to compare. I mean, even what he tells us of Jesus is very, very thin. He talks about signs and miracles and so on and so forth, but the specifics are very, very slim. We're not talking about a fully evolved theology.
Very, very detailed information about the Last Supper.
Well, yes, but I mean, the Last Supper was just a Passover Seder. There was nothing. I mean, he was Jewish. He knew what a Passover Seder was.
Oh, that's the way. Yeah, but the way the Last Supper was done, there were significant departures from that tradition. I mean, at no point in a Jewish Seder, apart from what has happened with the Eucharist and Christianity, does somebody hold up the bread and say, "This is my body," and the cup and say, "This is my blood"? That's what Paul knew about.
Yeah, but it's unlikely that he wouldn't have been able to learn that from anyone else. I mean, if this is something that had been happening for a couple of years by that point, I don't think we have an exact, down to the year thing, but it had been going on for about, 15, 20 years, 30 years, something like that, by the time he had his experience. It probably wasn't unknown to him. He probably had Christians tell him what was going on at these gatherings.
That seems really unlikely to me, because he was an enemy of the faith at the time.
Interrogating prisoners is not new.
The Eucharist was like a mystery religion, and outside initiates weren't privy to that part of it. That was secret. That was separate. When pagans found out about it, they were saying the Christians were cannibals because of it. It was not something that everyone was just shouting from the rooftops, "Hey, we eat Jesus."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, for pagans to have gotten the notion that they were cannibals, something about this had to have been slipped out.
Under torture, sure.
Yeah, I mean, rumors. What's that old saying about two can keep a secret if both of them are dead? Something like that. So we can't. It's hard to say for sure what exactly was known and unknown, but what we can say is, or at least what I would go so far as to say, that no amount of faith that Paul had, and no amount of faith that we might want to apply, will ever tell us that what we've believed is actually correct. That's why I say faith in and of itself really can't be a virtuous thing. Now, in the normal, everyday sense of, I trust my neighbor not to break into my house and murder my family while we're sleeping, okay, yes, but we all kind of have to have that. That's a far cry from the uber-galactic super deity is talking to people. There's a difference between the ordinary stuff that we do day to day because we don't have a choice, and the application of religious faith as a virtue.
I'm talking about that as a theoretical possibility. I mean, you don't have to grant that anyone actually has a virtuous faith in that respect, because you can say that's too much for me.
We could say it's theoretically possible. I mean, I'll grant that. Let's say it's theoretically possible.
That's all I was saying. I was
Yeah.
saying that you probably wouldn't even think you were conceding anything to
Sure.
even give
Yeah,
that
I
comment.
will happily say that, that's theoretically possible. Almost anything in some way, no matter how outlandish,
Sure,
is
like the
theoretically
two-part
possible.
orbiting Venus.
However,
You can grant the two-part orbiting Venus is a theoretical possibility, and
yes.
I don't think there's a two-part orbiting Venus.
Yeah.
You know?
However, I would go so far as to say that while we can call it a theoretical possibility, there's no way to actually tell if any one instance is.
Right.
It lacks
Yeah,
it lacks an
that.
element of falsification or confirmation.
Right. I'm gonna concede that, just as you conceded theoretical possibility. I'm gonna concede that from your perspective, there's no way for you to even reasonably grant that anyone out there actually does have a virtuous religious faith or ever has.
Mm-hmm.
How could you?
Yeah. How could anyone really, when it comes right down to it?
Well, I can.
Well, the problem with faith is that even in its finest form, in terms of the religious sense of the word, is it requires a degree of dishonesty from us. It requires us to be less interested in perpetuating our beliefs, or I'm sorry, less interested in the truth than in perpetuating our beliefs. Now, if we care about what's actually true, faith is not something we can ever turn to. So, even where someone says this person probably had a genuine epiphany, a revelation, a direct contact with a deity figure or a spiritual experience, no one else could ever regard that as more than anecdote because we don't have access to it.
I see what you're saying. Faith isn't, well, I don't think faith is something that you just, faith cannot be just reasonably decided upon. Someone can't just, spontaneously, 0 to 60 from nothing, instant, say, I'm going to have faith in something, because that's not really faith. That's incredulity. That's not a virtue. Okay?
But you mean don't you mean it's credulity? I think you said it's incredulity.
Yeah, you're right. It is.
Yeah.
Sorry.
There you go.
That's sheer credulity, and it's not a virtuous credulity.
Mm-hmm.
That would be just. In no way is that a virtue under any circumstances. Even if some people have religious faith, that's not what that is.
Yeah.
So it would only be a virtue, and it would only be faithful if these certain conditions that I named happened, and the person had a reasonable way of knowing from his own experience or her own experience that is true. So let me give you a concrete example. Let's say, out of my own experience, I was raised as a Catholic and then became convinced through TV and stupid TV and even stupider books that, fundamentalism was more plausible than Catholicism. This was when I was a teenager, so excuse me for that.
So you're talking fundamentalist Protestantism.
Yeah, I mean, in all but name, I had basically intellectually converted, and I was like, I really didn't regard Catholicism as the true faith. I regarded fundamentalist Protestantism as true, but I still went to church because I was going along with my family. And then I went to college and found out that my weird idea of what biblical inspiration and inerrancy was did not match up with the facts at all. And that what I thought meant an inerrant or inspired Bible meant, well, the Bible isn't that. If it's inerrant or inspired in any way, it's not that way, right? And so I wound up as an agnostic, and a hostile one at that, for about 9 years. I was the opposite of an evangelist. I was out to convert people away from their faith because I thought it was just the most pernicious, despicable thing in the world to believe something this ridiculous. And I had a couple of experiences over time that made me re-examine that, and it would be a long thing to go into that. So I'll just say I had them. Okay. And, during the last stages of that, I had this one particular one where Um, I won't call it a vision because it wasn't like it wasn't as if it was in front of my eyes, when they were open.
Mm-hmm.
It was more like a scene that was playing out in my head as if my imagination was doing it, but it was not under my control. Okay, and I could attend to other things and ignore it, and then look back at it, if you understand what I mean. Attend to it again, and it would be as if it was still going on. Okay, and it was basically a replay of my life. And along with that, as if it were like a laugh track in the background while you're watching a sitcom, was this experience of a pure knowing, not an inference, not a deduction, not a sense perception, but a pure knowing that all along there, that what I was seeing was the present. Within that was the presence of divinity, and in addition to that, there was the pure knowing of the identity of that divine being. So, at that point, I had to go with what I experienced. Because I'd always said, if God reveals himself to me, fine, I'll take it.
Okay.
Well, he did.
Okay.
So, I'm not asking you to believe that. I'm telling you, this is an experience.
Well, no, I could certainly believe that you experienced something like this. Now, I can think of a couple of different possible explanations that are purely physical, purely naturalistic, but you're a monotheist, right? I mean, you accept the Trinity.
Well,
but
more or less. I mean, I believe that there's, one absolute supreme being, but that doesn't mean that there aren't finite created spirits that people have called gods.
Mm-hmm. I mean, isn't it, how shall I phrase this? Okay, you are probably aware that people in other faiths experience this exact phenomenon that you're talking about.
I think that they experienced God.
Okay. Now, don't you find it even the least little bit strange that everybody just happens to experience the God that they were raised to believe in? Like, you don't have a Muslim who has an experience with the Virgin Mary. You don't have a Catholic who comes away saying that they experienced Vishnu. You don't have a Hindu coming away saying they experienced the goddess Bast. It's like that cat fancier in Texas who restarted the Bast cult after he says Bast appeared to him and commanded him to be her disciple. It's curious to me, to put it in the most mild of terms, that people experience the thing that is most familiar and most longed for. Now, the strongest indication here is that this is an internal state, most strongly related to our cultural mores, our upbringing, and the familiar touchstones that we are raised with. So, while your experience may very well have been genuine in terms of you're not making it up, you really did experience this, an internal brain state would certainly account for this just as well. And you didn't come away with a falsifiable position, for example, say knowing where the nearest Earth-like planet was. Knowledge you didn't already have. Coordinates that you could go out and look into a telescope and say, oh, so this is accurate. I really did have this direct contact. That's the first thing I would look for as a pragmatic, well, maybe not necessarily a planet, but certainly some falsifiable knowledge base. So you could have had a very genuine experience, and you very well could have been, from a theoretical standpoint, a deity. But from where I'm sitting, you didn't get anything that would actually confirm that it was anything other than an internal state that was very convincing.
Right. I can't. This is not transmissible knowledge.
Sure.
Okay. I mean, even if someone believes me, it's not really. It wouldn't be an act of supernatural faith, because then what they would need to do with that information, if they believed that, well, maybe Kevin did have an experience of God, is that they would have to go on and sort of petition God themselves and try to seek some sort of confirmation. Mm-hmm. And until they got that, it's not really faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, one thing that bothers me about these kinds of things, in principle, hypothetically assuming that it was genuine and true and God was revealing himself to particular people, is how inherently unfair that would be Because let's say you got a real experience. For you, heaven is a cinch. All right. You already know exactly what you're supposed to believe and how to get there. All right. I don't get that.
Mm,
And most of the world doesn't get that.
right.
Instead, we're supposed to guess. Now, we
Hmm.
could do all the research in the world, and people have come to a lot of different conclusions. I've concluded that no religion is true. Other people have concluded that Islam is true. Other people have concluded that Hinduism is true. Others have concluded that the animist
Right.
gods they were brought up with and wherever they're from are true. If you got the truth
Yeah.
and nobody else did, or very few other people did,
What does that
then
mean?
that means Judgment Day is uh, is going to be an interesting conversation,
Sure.
because my first question is, why did they get the free ride and I had to play a guessing game? And at that point, it would be impossible to act for a divine being to actually judge anyone in such a way as they don't get into heaven after the fact, because they couldn't have known the right things.
I can speak to that. I mean, but I don't want to interrupt you. So let me know when it's okay.
Oh no, that's fine.
Okay, cool. You brought up two things, and I don't want to neglect either one. I want to address them both. One was, why did Kevin get it? Isn't it a coincidence that when Kevin has his mystical experience, he has a mystical experience of Jesus Christ, but when Shri gets his mystical experience, it's the one of Krishna. Okay, why is it so culturally conditioned? I want to address that, and I also want to address why it is that it seems so unfair that some people get what you call a free ride, and they're definitely getting to heaven, while other people, well, they're screwed because they have to play a guessing game, and if they guess wrong, they're going to charbroil. Okay, so I want to address both of those. Okay, I'm going to go in order. The first one is, I believe that when the transcendent encounters, a psyche, a soul, in effect, that the transcendent being has created, and speaks to that soul, insofar as that happens, and sometimes that happens more with some people than others. It's that being speaks to the soul in something in what I would call a more primary language than the one that they were brought up to speak. The transcendent speaks in a kind of infant language of feelings and images. And in my case, I didn't even get an image. I got pure knowing. But I think that what I think is when Shri gets his experience of Krishna, he's getting an experience of God the Savior, and his culture calls that Krishna, and I think he's not wrong, because God knows what he means. You know what I'm saying? I think that there are lots of people who are sort of, you might call it imperfectly, united to the body of believers that God saves. And some people don't know that that's the church Christ founded, and they don't have to in this life. They'll eventually figure it out. They'll find out. But they're not necessarily going to burn in hell. They might have saving faith. I believe that. In many cases that's true, because I believe that God judges hearts, not just, he doesn't give you a theology exam, because we're all wrong to some degree. I believe the Catholic Church is the truth church. I believe Catholics are wrong to some degree, but I think that they have, maybe a purer version, culturally conditioned, but a purer version of revelation than others. But it is like layers and layers of these things. And there's no reason for everybody to have the same, as long as everybody ends up the best way that they could be, or everyone who wants to be. And so that's the first thing, that I don't think that the specific cultural religious differences are that important, because I don't think that that's what the body of believers really is. I don't see it as a religion. I see it as a partly visible, partly invisible communion. And with that includes, for the time being, certain language barriers and images and cultures and archetypes and that sort of thing that don't really ultimately, in a transcendent way,
They don't really matter.
provide you. So that was to address the first point. The second point, and I think the second point is also partly addressed by my answer to the first one, but the other one is I think that some people get more than others, but everybody gets enough and everybody gets a chance. And some people can say, well, this person got a very special revelation for some reason that God wanted. If there's a God, if there is such a God, but and then if there is such a God, I can ask for more than I'm getting right now and maybe get an answer. And if I don't, at least I tried. If God is ultimately just, he's not going to hold me accountable for having tried my best and not, because of his decision, not gotten it. And I believe that, I think that that there may be plenty of really good, decent people of various religions and no religion who, because they're doing the best they can, there might be some grace there that eventually can save their souls. I'm very open to an old Christian belief called apocatastasis, or at least some degree of apocatastasis, and that is the belief that everyone eventually gets saved. I don't really think that everyone eventually gets saved, but I think that lots of people who you would never think would get saved will.
That's interesting. Now, I do know that there was, a long time ago, there were questions about people who never heard the saving message and so on and so forth, and the answer to that was that they would be judged according to their virtues, the way they lived within the culture in which they lived. So that sounds kind of like what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's related, definitely.
Yeah. So like people who died of the plague before the missionaries could get over to the New World and spread their message and so on and so forth didn't automatically burn because they got sick first. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm familiar in loose form with that concept, which I can't argue with that. That's not a bad thing in principle, at least. But ultimately what it all comes down to me, is why do we believe, how do we determine whether something that we believe is something that we should believe, or whether or not it's something we should definitely not believe? And to me, the question always comes down to, what's the best path to truth? And the best path that I've ever found has been pragmatic empiricism, falsification of our positions, our claims. For example, this is one, I'm not sure if you remember this guy's name, Peter Popoff and James Randi. You remember those two?
Oh, yes. I remember that.
Yeah. The guy built...
Well, Randy definitely has my sympathy with that one. I'm not a big Randy fan, but when it came to him going up against Popoff, he was doing yeoman's work.
Yeah.
Good for him.
Yeah. Popoff, I don't think, is actually a true believer. I'm pretty sure he's just an ordinary scammer who found an easy niche to exploit. But he found millions of people who were willing to apply faith and to believe, without rigorous investigation, something that appeared to be true. Yeah. Because they didn't know that he had a radio. It wouldn't have been a miracle if he had just, oh, I've got this radio and we're reading off prayer cards. That wouldn't have been any big deal. But they applied faith to their beliefs and made him a very rich man for at least a short period of time. And it took one guy with a partner with one of those radio interceptor things to expose it as a fraud. A little pragmatic empirical skepticism. I don't see how faith...
I think I read his book about that, actually.
Yeah, I don't think I didn't read the book. I saw the documentary, An Honest Liar, the one about James Randi. If you haven't seen it, it's well worth watching. It's on Netflix, last I saw. It might be on Hulu now, too. Really, really good. Randy seems like a character. I'd like sort of the guy I'd like to hang out with.
Yeah, the book was worthwhile, too. There's a part where he says that he could hear... The person with the radio could hear Popoff's wife, and he knows Popoff's wife is a Catholic. So he's like, how is she justifying this in her mind? I mean, she's there with her rosary beads and thinking, I'm a liar, but that's okay because Hail Mary full of grace. I've got they're all dumb. They don't have Mary, and I do, so it's okay. I mean, it's hilarious.
It's amazing what people can rationalize to me. if we could wrap copper wire around the human ability to rationalize the irresponsible or the immoral and start it spinning, we could power the world
Oh
forever.
yeah, yes, yes, that's very true.
But to me, the most important thing that we can really answer for ourselves is not so much how did we get here, but how do we tell what's actually true about the world? Because when we have true information, we have information that has practical application. We guide our lives more accurately with, or more prosperously with accurate information than we would with false information. And to me, faith seems to be the worst way to get there because it can't. Even if you have accurate information, you have no way to know it. And even if you have grossly wrong information, it's never going to falsify it for you and tell you that you're wrong. So I guess you could say I just don't trust faith.
Right. Well, from my perspective, it all hinges on whether you have the accurate information and had a good and had a reasonable way of believing that it was accurate, even if it's not strictly empirical and falsifiable. It all depends on whether it's true. If it's not true, then it's definitely not faith in any virtuous sense. It's just an error,
Yeah.
and it might be something that can be excused, but it's
I
still
mean,
not
maybe
good.
sometimes we don't have a choice. We have to make decisions and we don't have all the
Right.
information. I mean, we do the best we can.
Well,
Wartime is an
science
excellent example of that.
is that too, because the science can be wrong. One of the things about science is that it can always be overturned by a
Oh,
better
yes.
understanding of
Yeah.
the facts.
Yeah. And that's the thing that I love most about science is it is a naturally self-correcting process as long as you follow the appropriate steps, as long as you follow all the stages that are required. If you're wrong, you will find out, or you'll find the limits of how accurate you are. For example, I mean, they knew Newtonian mechanics was not entirely correct even after it had been accepted because it wasn't accurately predicting the motions of some of the
I see what you're
planets.
saying.
Then you get Einstein and relativity and so on, and his did it perfectly, but Newtonian was so much easier and it was accurate enough. And it's like another example, the shape of the Earth. They use a flat Earth model for landing planes because the difference in elevation is so minor. It's like 2 inches per 100 yards or something really, really small. Doesn't really matter, and the flat model is just easier to apply.
Hmm.
But we actually
Well,
know
they
that
do
the
the
Earth
same
is
thing with
pear shaped to within a
they
couple
use
of inches.
centrism for satellites.
Yeah. The accuracy of the information may vary according to what your needs are, but you'll find your limits as long as you have a method of testing, falsification, and demonstration. And the ultimate demonstration is practical application and successful testable predictions. Faith can't get us any of that.
I'm gonna I'm going to present the possibility that there's some degree in which it can, because what I was talking about, I didn't quite get to finish. It was okay. I said a good deal and it might have been enough, but now I'm going to say more. And that is that I'm not just going on, one experience or a set of experiences a long time ago and hoping that they were right, because that wasn't the end. That was the beginning for me. And from then on, what I've developed was a relationship with the transcendent that has some back and forth to it. Now, you're not going to believe that there's no back and forth. You're going to think that it's all going on up here, and that's fine. But from my perspective, there's a lot of coincidences that were the case, and I don't buy that. There's some real interaction. It's not just me harkening back to something that happened a long time ago and hoping it was true. There's this constant confirmation, and it gets deeper and deeper, the way it would be if there was something real.
Okay. Well, all right, that's an interesting, let's call it, hypothesis that there is a real back and forth going on here. Now, as you pointed out earlier, you may recall that it can't create novel information if it's just in your head. Things that you don't know, if it's all in your head, then it doesn't know it. All right. So the simplest thing that we can do is go forth and confirm. I'm more than happy to put this to the test. I'll be happy to write a 26 character alphanumeric sequence on a notepad, put it on here on my desktop, and the next time you have a communication, ask it to convey that information to you, write it down, let me know what it is, and we can confirm that you are receiving communication from an external source. If you are, and this source is truly omnipresent and omniscient within the confines of the ability of anything to be those things, then this should be a very simple confirmation. But if it's all in your head, then there is no conceivable way that this could pass.
That doesn't seem all that simple at all.
Well, it seems very simple. We could do this with 3 people. I mean, if I remember Catholic doctrine, God can do all things logically possible.
Yes.
And this would be logically possible. We could do this with 3 people, and an independent person be able to confirm it.
I'm saying, here's why I think that is not all that reasonable or fair a test as you're making it out to be. The back and forth I have isn't like a cell phone conversation or what we're doing right now. It's more like I have a prayer, I pray for something, and then something uncanny happens that connects to that prayer. I don't get whispers in my ear with specific information about that. At least not voluntarily. It doesn't come from me. I don't get to dial a number. Okay? I get, you could call it faxes, okay? And I can't command a fax.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, you can't just command this thing to cooperate. However, if this deity is not the author of confusion, and this particular deity can communicate through words, which, if we believe that Paul, for the sake of argument, did hear actual words where someone spoke to him and said, I am so-and-so whom you persecute, and so on, then words are certainly possible. Yeah. Then there's nothing impossible about this test. Yeah. Now, it may be that it refuses to cooperate, but that's an argument with no answer, because we can always say that. I mean, it's like the hunt for Bigfoot. You can always just say, well, he's hiding better than we're looking, no matter how well you look. It's the space teapot or the dragon in the basement.
Yeah. You certainly would have no reason to give any credence to that as actually true.
Well, I'm not saying that you're not telling the truth. I'm sure as you see it, you are telling the truth. You wouldn't go so far as to say that. You just don't think that you don't think I'm right. Correct. And I think I think that your attribution is inaccurate. Now, as a person who is very concerned with true information and holding true beliefs, this is something if I thought I had this kind of communication, I would jump to it. I would find a volunteer for it, and the next time that kind of communication occurred, tell me what this number is, or tell me what the sequence is, because I'd want to know. Now, belief it's one thing to believe things. It's another thing to know them. And if we're going to guide our lives through this world that we all have to share, that we all have to have in common, and throw our weight and time and resources behind a belief, behind a cause that has wider implications for the entire world. For example, you're part of the Catholic Church. It's a very large organization, for better or for worse. It does do some good things, has done some bad things, but if it merits your support, and this is the true church, and this is the church of this particular being, if I were in your position, I'd want to know, not just believe, that I was throwing my support behind the right thing. Now, of course, I understand the unwillingness to do so. In fact, I think only one person that I've ever who's suggested that they are engaged in divine communication or been subjected to divine communication has accepted this particular challenge, and it did not go well for them. No.
I'm going to bring up another reason. I had this in my back pocket a second ago. This comes up because of what you just said about really how much is at stake. You just brought up how much is at stake. Mm-hmm. Okay, when there's a lot at stake, people who are not convinced of a thing tend to ratchet up their skepticism. So I'm going to propose that even if I accepted that proposal and somehow gave you the correct information, you might be like, well, that's very interesting, Kevin. I'm going to have to think about that. But I think the next time I talked about it, it's not 100% sure that you're going to say, well, yeah, I just got baptized.
Well, you might be right. Now, having no one I cannot say how I would react if somebody actually did this and actually passed. I don't know. Nobody ever has. 99 out of 100 are never willing to undertake it. However, the important thing here is not what I believe. I would, at the very least, be forced to announce publicly, hey, he passed. But the most important thing here is not what I believe. The most important thing here is, what do you know? You are the one who is shaping your life around this, not I. And if it matters most to you to throw your life and your support and everything that you are behind this, and there's a possibility, however improbable it may be in your mind, that you're wrong, wouldn't it be appropriate to put it to the test?
Well, I think I have. Because one of my experiences involved asking for something that was basically, in my mind, impossible. And it happened. Okay? That was enough for me. And this was even before the experience that I described to you. But that experience, where I asked for something that was, in my mind, basically impossible, and it happened inexplicably to me, that brought me from a hard and hostile agnosticism to a generic theism. I still wasn't religious, per se. But I was like, well, there's something. I don't know what that is. You can call it a God. I don't know what God is. So I'll call it a God, too, if that's the word. Whatever it is, there's something. And that was where I was.
Yeah. Now, my mother is a... Did I ever tell you about anything about my mother? Did I ever mention her? I don't think
If you did,
yeah. She is a devout Protestant, former Catholic, from Panama City, Panama. And what brought her away from Catholicism and into Protestantism was the differences in prayer. In Catholicism, saints are very important. You go to a saint and they intercede on your behalf before God. She was brought to Protestantism essentially by somebody saying, well, why not just go directly to God? That's the short version. Now, but the interesting thing regarding my mother is that she has always believed that she has had visions. That, for example, many, many years ago, I was near death. I was in the hospital with a heart condition. It had a 100% fatality rate up to the year I was born. I was given a novel surgery, which obviously worked because here I am. But during this particular time, she talked about an experience where she was in the hospital and she thought that she saw angels and demons fighting overhead over the heads of people in the waiting area, like they were fighting on behalf of the people in the hospital. Now, this is something that she believes to be very true. And she's had a number of different visions over the course of her life. She's not crazy. I mean, like, I wouldn't throw her in a nut house or anything like that. She's a very functional woman. She has lived her whole life. She's now in her late 80s, early 90s. These are just parts of her life that she believes very profoundly to be true. All right. I never had any visions like she did. I did have occasions where I prayed for something and I thought I got an answer. I thought I experienced the Holy Spirit. I thought that I experienced all kinds of things. I was a very devout young man growing up. Looking back on one as a troubled, I wouldn't say troubled, but more like an anxious teenager, I'd had a lot of trouble with math. I was afraid of being left back if I didn't pass my exam. And I mean, I was vomiting sick with worry about failing tests and whatnot. So, I mean, I got down on my knees and I prayed for an answer. And then I went to the Bible and flipped to a random page and I found something in there that I thought was relevant to me. And I thought that that was communication from God. These are all parts of life for all of us, things that we believe to be true. that we believe to be a kind of communication, that we believe our experiences to be genuine. But to me, it all comes back, as I am now, to how do we tell our beliefs are actually true? When we talk about, oh, I came up with this answer. Okay. Was that answer impossible in any other way? Might seem that way, but probably not. And the way I came to the idea of a 26 character alphanumeric sequence, it isn't coincidence. That much isn't. I'm a computer geek, and 26 character randomized alphanumeric sequence with upper lowercase numbers and letters, almost, especially throw some symbols in there, and it's almost impossible to guess. Even a brute force attack at 26 characters, you're going to be months.
The universe to get it.
Yeah, months trying to break through. It's basically peak level security. That's why I went with something that's that complex. Because if it's true, and if this communication is feasible, and if this is actually happening, then this is easily passable, just as I would, if I know my password, if I have something written down, it's easy to put in. But I'm never going to be able to guess it.
Right. Okay, I'm going to address, first I'm going to address the thing about, and then first I want to address a specific point, and then I want to take my turn to tell a little bit of a story too. First, the first specific point is about the difference between, is faith knowing if you can't know that it's faith? Okay, how can you confirm it? And I'm going to say that from a classic epistemology, from that kind of point of view, that just from a classical definition of knowledge, there's a distinction between knowing something and being certain about it. So you can know things without being certain, and then you find out that you were right. But it's not the case that you didn't know them before you got it confirmed. You knew them if it was, number one, true, and number two, justified. That is, you had a good reason to believe it, and the truth of it is what caused you to know it. It being true, the conditions of being true were all part of the causative factors of you coming to that idea. Then you knew it, whether you're certain.
Sure, you're talking justified true belief. Yeah, I've heard this one.
Might know, even if they can't confirm it or be certain in a strict sense. Mm-hmm. So that's one point. And now the other thing I want to say is, oh gosh, I blanked out on it, so you might as well respond to that part, and then I'll come if it comes back.
It'll come back to you.
It comes back to me outside.
Okay. Well, that's yeah. As far as justified true belief goes, yeah, sure, you can go with that. That being said, for example, this is something that works very well in ordinary, everyday experience. But when we're talking about something that actually contradicts empirical reality, demonstrable reality, when it requires that our universe not work the way that it evidently does in purely physicalist means, in purely material terms, I don't think that could be that it could be justified. From a hypothetical standpoint, we could say that it actually would be true, but we wouldn't be able to ever actually justify it because it runs counter to in the way the universe empirically functions, and it requires us to accept a state of functioning in the universe that cannot be empirical or which cannot be demonstrated. Plus, we also happen to know that this particular form of belief system, or this particular type of belief, is so rampant with fraud, error, mistakes, outright deception, or even honest misunderstandings, or even actual known medical conditions. Now, let's say hypothetically that, let's go back to Paul for a moment. From a hypothetical standpoint, he has no idea what kind of explanation could suffice for his experience. Let us say hypothetically that all he had was a seizure. He just had an epileptic fit. He has obviously he's gone now, but hypothetically all he had was an epileptic fit. His belief is no longer true, and it was never justifiable, but he'd have no way of knowing either way.
Right.
So when we're talking about something so profound, I don't think it could ever be a justified belief, even if it were true, since we have no way of knowing, and ample examples where it is definitely not what people believed it to be, or at least highly probable that it's not what they believed it to be, or where we can actually recreate it artificially and show that, hey, this is just a brain state. I don't think it could ever be justified.
That kind of skeptical questioning, there's really no way of getting off that train, in principle. It either keeps going off the cliff, or, you have to arbitrarily stop it. Because you could always say, no matter what I know and no matter what happened, it could have been a hallucination. I could be in the Matrix.
Mm-hmm.
You can bring skepticism up to the nth degree. There's really no ceiling on that. If someone had an experience of God, they directly know it.
Well, that's the thing. How would you distinguish a direct experience from a God from a hallucination of the same?
Let's say that there's no way to verbally describe the distinction. That doesn't mean, number one, that there isn't one, and number two, it still doesn't mean that they don't directly know what they directly know.
Well, actually, it kind of does. It means they just believe it. If you can't tell, that's why I went back to falsification, direct communication. Any independent agent, independent mind, which is capable of communicating information to others, can falsify and demonstrate its own existence and communication of the same if it so chooses. The fact that nobody can ever pass something that is, like, if there's a third person and you don't believe that I've been talking to, and you don't believe that person exists, their existence is falsifiable. Their communication is demonstrable. There is the very same form of examination. Now, we could. You're wrong about something, though. Skepticism is. Well, let me rephrase that. You're wrong in part. Skepticism ceases to be rational at a certain point. You could be skeptical to an unlimited degree. I mean, to the nth degree, to the point where you're a hard solipsist and nothing is real and everything is imaginary and so on and so forth. But rational, pragmatic, demonstrable skepticism that seeks to get to an actual determined truth isn't limitless. There comes a point where something is clearly so, where something is demonstrable, where something has shown that it has the ability to make testable predictions, that it has practical application, where we can say, this is accurate, and any further skepticism of it ceases to be rational. Like the people who are really big on 9/11 conspiracies. No amount of evidence will ever do. The Sandy Hook conspiracy theorists. No amount of evidence will ever do. The people who are convinced that ancient aliens are responsible for the pyramids, like people in in ancient times couldn't stack rocks. There comes a point where someone just becomes a denialist.
Right. Well, what I'm saying is, theoretically, if there were a God, and if that God revealed himself to a person, and this person was experiencing this, there's no way for him not to know it. It may not be third party available.
Well, sure. I mean, it's not accessible to the other person.
At least can't not know.
Well, see, I don't think that that's the case. Now, they could certainly, how shall I phrase this? When you say that they can't not know it, I'd say that it's impossible for them to know it, because their experience probably real in the sense that there was really an experience. But again, I mean, if you can't differentiate an experience from a hallucination or an illusion or a delusion or simple coincidence or chemical inducement, which is another thing that natives around the world have done for countless years to induce spiritual experiences. Uh, Before a thing merits belief, at least the simplest and most obvious should be ruled out. And the simplest and most obvious is always, this is a purely localized internal state relating to my brain. It is purely naturalistic, and there is not a deity communicating with me from some beyond, some transcendent alternate state. That's the simplest explanation. How do we eliminate that? To the best of my knowledge, most people don't even try. And before you get to the point where you say, this is a deity, you should at least try.
I think you've just shown why, if there were a God, everybody doesn't get that kind of revelation, because it doesn't seem like it would be worthwhile. Most people wouldn't believe it.
I don't know. You know what? It would be nice if
none of them should.
it would be nice if the guys who were running ISIS would get a vision telling them to knock the stuff off that they keep doing. But
Well, according to you, that if they obeyed that, they would just be yet another instance of their credulity and unreasonableness.
well, yep, they might not be reasonable to believe it, but if they'd knock it off, I'd be willing to settle.
Well, yeah, certainly nice.
You know, I'd be willing to
Nice
settle.
from our
Hey,
perspective.
if someone believes something irrational that has them just doing good stuff, or at least not doing evil, generally speaking, I'll let it be. uh, you know, I think a lot of people have some harmless, kooky, off the wall stuff that they believe that doesn't necessarily have any connection to empirical reality, but most of it is harmless. I get concerned with harmful stuff. There's enough of that going around as it is. But if I ever had that kind of experience, I'd want to not just believe that it was an internal brain state or that it was a deity. I'd want to have some kind of a confirmation. No matter how profound it seems,
I remember the story
I'd
when I
want to
was
go
young.
from belief to knowledge. Well,
I,
it's been.
I suddenly remembered the story that I wanted to tell earlier. Okay, remember I was saying that the mystical experiences I described were the beginning, not the end, and there was a lot of ongoing. Well, it's been pretty. Oh, I have two stories now. Okay, here's the first one. Okay, one of them is that besides my interaction with a deity, there's also my interaction with other people in communion with the deity that have been uncanny things that have happened. There's one person in particular who I have a very strong spiritual bond with, and we were able to have what you might call ESP test sessions, parapsychology experiments in effect, where, when we knew we were in a certain state, we would say, well, okay, what color am I looking at? What song am I listening to? And we would just go back and forth, just keep getting it right, getting it right, getting it right, getting it right, So we're not, what I'm saying is I'm not asking you to believe that I actually had psychic experiences. What I'm saying is, from the perspective of someone with faith, it's not simply I had a certain experience a long time ago that I'm credulously attributing a deity to. There's a lot between then and the present. There's a lot of ongoing support that keeps it going. And so, that might help you understand why people who have faith continue to have it. So that was one. That was one story, and the other is, and this is another thing like that. Okay, all along in my relationship with the transcendent, or what I consider a relationship with the transcendent, I'm having lots of tiny little confirmations and big ones and small ones, and it's just varying degrees. The thing that you told me about your mom, hit upon something, and on a scale of 1 to 10, it's like 2 or 3, in terms of confirmation. It's like always little things, I just wrote 2 or 3 long pieces about the Catholic practice of devotion to saints, because I personally, for most of my life, both before, not let alone my agnosticism, but even while I was Catholic before that, and then converted to Catholicism after that, devotion to saints was something a little bit on the periphery. Like I might say a rosary once in a while, but I didn't have a strong devotion to it. I always felt like there was something less intimate and it was sort of superfluous about that practice, for the same reason that your mother became convinced of because of somebody else's question. Why not go directly to God? Well, I always did. So this was always, it seemed like something on ancillary and unimportant, and not really, why even do it? That even when I did it, that was always in the back of my mind. But recently I began to do something called the novena. The novena exercise is where you have a 9-day, you do 9 prayers, one each day for the course of 9 days, where you ask God for something through the intercession of a particular saint, where you address the saint directly, ask for their intercession, ask for their prayers, and also ask God through the intercession of Saint blah, 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 this request. And what I found, what I can testify to, is that it was like getting a backdoor password right directly to where you want your prayers to go, because prayer answers started coming much faster and much more spectacularly when I started doing this. And I was wondering, why would that be? Why would that be more effective than going directly to God? And I had to put a lot of thought into that to come up with an answer. And the answer that I came up with actually goes directly to why any prayer works at all, if it could. If there were a God, why would prayer matter? Why doesn't God just give us everything that we need? Well, and the reason would be that if one of the things we need is to be related to Him and to depend on Him, then He would hold back certain blessings until we asked for them. And if one of the things we needed was to love each other and not just Him, then He would hold back certain blessings until we asked each other for help too, and each other's intercession towards God. And so, but I'm bringing that up because, you brought up the saint thing, and I was like, that's a 2 or a 3 out of 10 for me, because I just wrote 2 essays about that last week.
Huh. Well, that's interesting. I'm not familiar with how did you say it? Novena?
Novena. N-O-V. It means 9. It's Latin.
Okay.
And so you can do 9 hours, 9 consecutive hours if you want to get it done quick, in one day, or you can do 9 days, but it's 9 prayers.
Huh.
And it started working for me so well that I recently began a practice that I call the Novena Novenorum, the Novena of Novenas, where I invoke 9 saints over the course of 9 days and begin 9 novenas. So it lasts for 17 days, because you're beginning a new one each day, but you do them all. On the 9th day, I'm doing a lot. I'm at day 7. But it doesn't separate me from God or put anything in between. It's like the opposite. It's like
knowing the bouncer at a club.
It's like ushering me right to the front.
Or like knowing the door guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting way of looking at it. And of course, that actually is an interesting point of theology. I hadn't really thought about it that way. Interesting. But, okay, we have gone a little over an hour now. Thanks for your time. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Robert. This was delightful. Yes, as always.
Yeah, always a pleasure.